Welcome to Detroit Opera's OperaHere podcast. This is Arthur White coming to you from the Detroit Opera House. Joining me today is Nathalie Doucet, the head of music and director of the Detroit Opera Resident Artist Program. Nathalie, thank you once again for joining me.
Arthur, it's such a pleasure to be with you and to talk about opera and everything we're doing at the Detroit Opera House. And to all our listeners, we're thrilled you have joined us as we take a look at John Cage's revolutionary and immersive operatic experience, Apartment House 1776. This production, as all our productions this year actually, is the first time Detroit Opera has mounted this work in a 54-year history. We've been doing that all season, it feels like. And today we will speak about the piece, its composer, and we will be in conversation with the director, Alexander Gedeon, and one of the performers, Selena Kearney. Apartment House 1776 opens May 21st and runs through May 24th at the Cranbrook Art Museum in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan.
John Cage was an American composer, artist, and music theorist. A pioneer of indeterminacy in music, electroacoustic music, and the non-standard use of musical instruments, Cage was one of the leading figures of the post-war avant-garde, and critics lauded him as one of the most influential composers of the 20th century. Cage studied under Henry Cowell and Arnold Schoenberg, both known for their radical innovations in music. But Cage's major influence lay in various East and South Asian cultures. Through his studies of Indian philosophy and Zen Buddhism in the late 1940s, Cage came to the idea of chance-controlled music, where he started composing in 1951. He would go on to employ this approach in all of his work for the rest of his life. Now, Cage's best-known work is his 1952 composition, 433, a piece performed in the absence of deliberate sound. Musicians who perform the work do nothing but be present for the duration specified in the title, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The content of the composition intended to be the sounds of the environment heard by the audience during the performance. This work changed assumed definitions about musicianship and music experience, and it made it a popular and controversial topic both in musicology and the broader aesthetics of art and performance.
As the United States approaches its semi-quincentennial, its 250th birthday this coming July 4th, Detroit Opera decided to bring Apartment House 1776, originally conceived by John Cage for the U.S. bicentennial in 1976, to Detroit in 2026. Those are a lot of sixes. This immersive work places us at the crossroads of the nation's colonial foundations, imagined as a chorus of voices drifting from apartment windows. We are invited to listen, share, and consider how the multiplicity of 1776 still resonates today. The work was commissioned and premiered back in 1976 by the 6 orchestras of Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, Los Angeles, New York, and Philadelphia. This work calls for 4 solo vocalists who represent religious traditions practiced at the U.S.'s founding in 1776. They select authentic songs from their respective traditions to perform. The singers are accompanied by versions of anthems and congregational music written by composers who were at least 20 years old at the time of the American Revolution, which Cage recomposed by means of chance operations. This music will be performed by members of our wonderful Detroit Opera Orchestra. No 2 audience members will have the same 90-minute experience, so you can come many, many times.
So I got to tell you, Nathalie, I had known of 433, but of course we got a big immersion here in Detroit when we brought your operas 3 and 4 to Detroit back in 2024. So tell us about your memories about that. Of course, that was at the Gym Theater, of course.
First of all, John Cage's 4-minute, 33-second piece was something that I heard about in school. And it's one of my best pieces. I play it like a virtuosic pianist. It's really quite interesting and something that we would often talk about in musicology classes. So I knew that about Cage, but I didn't know much more. And then when your operas came on our programming, I was excited to experience. I had no idea what to expect. And we did it at the Gem Theater, and it was really interesting. And what I found fascinating was the randomization. Everything was randomized. So the choice of repertoire the costumes, the staging, the props, everything was kind of randomized. So you could have somebody dressed as, the Toreador and Carmen, and then singing a completely different aria and mopping the floor at the same time. So, but what I found really interesting is that sometimes the music and the actions, they converged into perfect moments on stage. I seem to remember at one part, one of the pianists had randomly, they had the beginning of the William Tell overture, the Lone Ranger song. And at that point, this big armored man got pushed up to the front of the stage, and the audience just erupted in laughter. And I think that for me encompasses the experience of your operas in its chaotic, amazing, immersive experience.
I have to agree with you. So when I knew we were doing your operas 3 and 4, because we have to talk about it to the public before it actually goes up, and I was not quite sure what I was going to think of this piece, but I was surprised myself how much I enjoyed it. I think because of the chance operations, it's not like they all start at the same time. So they're kind of staggered and they're kind of all over the place. And so when you put them together, even though they're individually 6 arias that you probably know or would have heard before, but when you put them together, it's a whole different music. It's a whole different experience, which of course, I guess that's what John Cage was going for. So I remember really loving 3 and 4 a lot more than I had ever imagined that I was going to. So I'm very curious to hear how Apartment House is going to sort of pan out with now. Of course, in this case, we're going to have orchestral members. We didn't have an orchestra. It's pretty much all piano. I think it was 2 pianos.
2 pianos, yeah.
That's right, for 3 and 4. So it's going to be interesting to add this element. I guess there's also some percussion. There's a timpani and some other things. So it's going to be a totally different experience. I can't wait to hear it. But you probably are very familiar with this particular piece in particular. It's been on your mind because 3 of our 4 resident artists take major roles in this. And wonder if you could talk to us about that.
Correct. 3 of our resident artists, not 4 because one of them is already off to his next adventure at Opera Theater St. Louis. Cole Bellamy is not with us for the end of the season, so we regret he won't be there. But we have Brianna J. Robinson, our amazing soprano, and Mia Mondino, who's also a fantastic soprano, and Travis Leon Williams are all leads in this Apartment House 1776. And what's really fascinating is the incredible amount of research they did, because the director, Alexander Gedeon, had conversations with them to talk about their background, their story, what they wanted to focus on during their performances. So it's not random as your operas in ways like we just choose songs. All the songs and the repertoire they chose have meaning to them and meaning to their background and their upbringing and their life. So I think that was a very deep dive into their personal story. And I know that they worked really hard to find the right set of songs that worked for the thread of their story. So I'm really excited to see. I don't even know. It's kind of like a private thing that they did. And I'm excited to see, what they have in store during this wonderful opportunity to get to know them a little better.
Fantastic. So as you spoke, I just love that word, semi-quincentennial. I get to say it 100 times. And so, as I said, we've been talking about looking at opera, where we have come as a country, how we've come over this time. But I'm wondering, I know you're a Canadian. How does this semi-quincentennial resonate with you as now that you're living in America?
Well, I am Canadian and proud to be so. But I've been away from Canada longer than I actually lived in Canada in some way. So, having lived in Europe and in the United States, I feel sort of like a citizen of the world. So, and being a Canadian, being somebody that's as a guest in this country, there are so many things I love about the U.S. and so many things to really cherish. So I'm really excited to be celebrating this in the United States. There are things that we could talk about that I won't, but either way, I think we should be proud of many, many things being here in America. I'm very proud to be here as a guest and to be here at Detroit Opera in a great city with great people. I love Americans, and I wouldn't be here if I didn't. So I'm super excited to celebrate America in any way I can.
Fantastic, indeed. All right. Well, we probably need to bring in our 2 guests who are going to tell us more about what we're going to see and hear in this production.
The first is the director of the production of Apartment House 1776. He is a multidisciplinary artist and critically acclaimed director of opera and concert theater based in New York City. Embracing a multitude of forms and genres, his work has been called provocative, visually stunning, and a perfect experimental approach to opera. Directing highlights include 2 Rolling Stone video premieres for Grammy-winning vocalist Judith Hill, This Ghost of Slavery for the National Museum of African American History, written and performed by Anna DeVere Smith, with Yuval Sharon, and in March he took the revival of Yuval Sharon's Comet-Popea to the Yale Repertory Theater, Mr. Alexander Gedeon.
It's great to be here.
Selena Kearney is a Coast Salish artist working across performance and photography. Raised on the Chehalis Reservation, she grounds her practice in cultural continuity and transmission of song, centering the ways sound and image are carried within systems of relation and how indigenous presence moves between what is shown and what is held back. Please welcome Selena Kearney. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much. So, Alex, I want to start with you specifically as the sort of the director here. First of all, can you tell us more about what we're going to see and hear at Cranbrook Art Museum on May 21st?
Yeah, happy to do so. So John Cage's Apartment House 1776 is actually a concert piece that he wrote in 1976 to commemorate the bicentennial for 4 singers and any number of instrumentalists. In this case, we're going to have 35 instrumentalists from the Detroit Opera Orchestra. And for this production, we're taking his concert theater piece and making an immersive operatic installation in the Cranbrook Art Museum, which will be several rooms that you can move and walk through with a pre-show experience and a show that will be completely different for everybody who sees it every time that they go to see it.
So, Alexander, I know you've been working with the singers on song selection and how it affects their performance, how it affects the whole piece of Apartment House 1776. Can you talk to us a little bit about the process in doing that and how it felt to you to work with the singers so closely on what they're going to contribute to this project?
Sure. So what's interesting about John Cage's piece is that he didn't actually compose any music. He's a composer, but for the piece, he basically created a type of recipe. If you saw your operas 3 and 4 a couple of years ago, you'll be sort of familiar. He called them like recycled operas. The basic idea is that 4 singers choose music and create their own program based on their spiritual and ethnic heritage. And then they choose what they want to sing and when they want to sing it during the show, and then sing their program as if they were alone and with no coordination with what the other singers are singing at the moment. So what ends up is you have sort of a simultaneity of voices that are singing. And so in the selection process, I mean, it really goes to sort of the heart of the whole process, asking singers to choose a program based on their spiritual and ethnic heritage is basically asking them to identify ethnically a certain sort of way. And so there's certain aspects of that were a little bit problematic that we wanted to challenge a little bit sometimes. So if somebody, wanted to choose music that wasn't specifically identified with their ethnic heritage, and there was a good reason for them to do so, we tried to allow them to do that. So each singer basically chose something different. Travis Williams, who's one of the resident artists, chose a program of all Negro spirituals. Brianna Robinson made some interesting choices. She chose one Negro spiritual, but she also chose a program of classical compositions written by Black composers, historical Black composers, and chose one piece written by Daniel Bernard Romaine that was written only a few years ago. So she was sort of breaking the rules with finesse, you might say. Mia Mandanao is doing a program of traditional Greek and Jewish melodies, and one piece by Massenet from Manon. And Selena Kearney is doing tribal songs from her Coast Salish heritage.
Fantastic. Well, that brings me to the next question. I guess our first question for Selena. Selena, can you talk to us about your approach to the work on this project, your work? What does it mean bringing an Indigenous perspective at this time and place?
Yeah, I was aware of the songs in a way that was what I wanted to share, like what would be public, what I wanted to bring to a public space, and what I would normally sing in a space for more like Native ceremony, Native ritual. And so I chose 4 songs that I felt would be very public songs, songs that could be shared and that I felt comfortable doing so.
So, Selena, tell me, I was reading in your biography this idea of songs through oral tradition. And I know as an African American, often spirituals when I was a young man, I would often hear my mother's knee or grandmother's knee singing spirituals, which talked about this sort of history of past, characters, John Henry and that sort of thing. Can you tell us about how that relates to maybe some of your experience with some of your Indigenous songs?
Yeah, I would say that we don't say that we write a song or that the song is written by someone. We say that we catch or carry a song. So I think that that's a way that I would think about it. Like it's an oral tradition and they're passed on and knowledge is passed on, but really it's a lack of feeling like you have some sort of authority or authorship over the spirit of the song. And I would say that the songs are meant to work around different activities. So being grateful or paddling in a canoe, being welcomed, performing, things like that.
Yeah. Are any of these songs going to be included in your 4 selections?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to do the Chief Dan George song, which is the Coast Salish anthem. It's a very public song. It's also a very powerful song. It would be the song you would sing at the very end of a night, but also a song that, like if a tribe was asked to sing to open up a hockey game or something like that, that they could bring to an arena where many different people are present. And then I'm going to sing Mariana Harvey's grandmother song, which is in her language Hapton. She's from the Yakima tribe. And it's a gratitude song for our grandmothers. So like you're thanking your grandmother on your father's side and then also on your mother's side. And then I'll sing 2 songs that I caught. One is From Night to Day, which is a song about being welcomed to dream when you sleep. And then a Prairie Fire. And in my tribe, the Chehalis tribe, we will set fire to certain parts of prairies in order to have them burn and then they come back revitalized. And so that's a song that I caught about putting parts of the prairie on fire.
I love that idea of catching songs. That's fantastic.
I like that. I have a question actually for Alexander, because we mentioned our amazing Detroit Opera Orchestra. How are we using our orchestra musicians during this Apartment House 1776?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, the experience is actually happening in 4 gallery spaces at the same time. They are interconnected, but the 35 musicians will be sort of spread out between the 4 rooms. And they've been grouped together a little bit thematically, but it's John Cage, so really randomness is the flavor of the day.
And they have a list of music that they can choose from, and they get to choose their own selections as well. Isn't that right?
Yeah, they get to make their own program based off of a catalog of music that John Cage offers to them. One part of it is called the 44 Harmonies. Actually, the Arditi Quartet made a pretty successful record of just those 44 harmonies. There's the 44 harmonies, the 14 tunes, and these are all materials that come from 6 different composers that were American born, that were alive, and his requisite was that they were 21 years old in 1776. Every section of musicians gets to choose their own program of what they play, and then they play them all at the same time with no coordination of what the other sections are playing.
Actually, that brings me to another question that we had talked about before we brought you on, about this idea that Cage had really embraced this chance controlled or chance operation. Wondering could you tell us, like, how is that going to be used for this particular project?
You know, if you've never experienced one of these kinds of shows, it's almost impossible to explain what it feels like. You know, chance operations is the idea that you have material that you want to perform, and you're going to randomize some element of how it's going to appear in front of the audience. And, you're like, why on earth would you do that? But I think the simple answer is that it's fun. If there are things that are recognizable, if you think about everything that you're scrolling, that you're looking at one random thing after another. And if you imagine all of those things kind of coming to life at once, being in a three-dimensional environment that you could see them, you would have everywhere to look and everything to listen to. Would it be overwhelming? Yeah, maybe a little bit. Or it could also be sort of like, when you're sitting by the river and you hear the sounds of two different birds singing in two different keys, and the sound of the river and the sound of the wind, you kind of experience a field of everything happening at once. So Cage has already created that experience with the music, the way that the singers choose their own programs and the musicians are choosing their own things. And then we sort of take some of these ideas in terms of how we make theater out of it too. But rather than add more randomness, I think when we were making a piece of theater out of this, we actually wanted to add more depth and more clarity to these choices so that the things that are happening simultaneously around you feel deeper and richer and more connected to the spiritual intention that's behind some of the songs.
Alexander, I have such good memories of working on your operas 3 and 4 when you were here a couple of seasons ago. We did at the Gem Theater with Yuval. And I remember that being my first experience with Cage. I know some of our listeners are probably came to that performance, was really successful, and we have some Cage aficionados. What is the difference between, for people who had never been to a John Cage performance and came to your operas and they're going to come to Apartment House 1776, what is the difference between these two, in both immersive experiences? But what would be the biggest difference for you if you had to compare?
Well, okay, your operas is really, he's having a conversation about opera. He was commissioned by a German opera house to create a piece, and sort of, instead of writing something new, he made this thing called Europeras, which is spelled EURO. So it's a pun, like your operas, right? So he's an American composer, is like, this is what it gets. And really, it's like a random collection of all of the history of the opera tradition smashed together, as if you kind of took all of it in a box and just shook it up and dumped it out like a box of toys onto the carpet. And, kids, this is a really radical idea, that he's playing with. And again, it sounds so crazy if you've never experienced it. But when you understand that he's playing with these ideas of this recycle, like that when we take things that we already know and we put them in a new context, completely different things can emerge in ways that can be surprising to us. So Apartment House is the same kind of idea, except he's positioned the spiritual and ethnic tradition of songs as the forefront of the experience. And he did it on the bicentennial. So there is an inherently political aspect, even though he claims that his work is not political at all. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. So there's an inherently historical, both backwards looking angle at this, but there is an inherent also forward looking or present day acknowledgement in the basic structure of the piece as well.
Selena, in your bio, you speak about how indigenous presence moves between what is shown and what is held back. And just wondering, could you explain what you mean by that and just talk a little more about that?
Yeah, I am not going to be able to show the entirety of my personhood or my background in any space that I enter into. And so the responsibility I have to show what represents an Indigenous person or a Coast Salish person looms large. What I can't give you the entirety of it. I also can't give you what would be expected from an Indigenous person. I can show enough that it provokes thought and curiosity and also gives some sort of knowledge. But I think that I'm not going to be able to show everything of what it means to be an Indigenous person. But also, people who witness an Indigenous performance bring their own set of assumptions to that space. So I meet them somewhere in between.
Wow. Fantastic. Well, now that reminds me of another question. I wanted to run back to Alexander, if I can. You talked about when this premiere happened at the Bicentennial in 1976. It was all done in concert style. How did we decide, or how was it decided that this would be dramatized in this way with with settings? Was it something you'd worked on with Yuval Sharon, our artistic director, or how did that come about?
Yuval and I have been working together for 8 years, and our first show that we did was a large-scale John Cage piece. So I've worked with him closely, and I consider him to be a mentor. And working on John Cage's work had a transformational impact on how I see art and how I construct work as a director. I'm sort of addicted to this idea of collaging things in a way. I think we see it in visual art a lot. We're actually more accustomed to it in music than we think, but it's pretty radical when you start putting live performances that were designed separately next to each other. It's really kind of a psychedelic experience, I would say. So Yuval had the plan to stage Apartment House 1776 at Detroit, and eventually he wasn't able to do the project. And so last year, when he was considering what to do with it, he asked me if I was interested in taking it over, and I was super excited to do so. Also pretty scared, I will admit, to jump on it, because I was like, oh, this is John Cage, but now this is so much more political. How can this not be political? And I was a little daunted by that prospect at the beginning, but the more that I worked on it, the more I got really excited about the implications of what it could mean.
Wow. Well, if I could just continue, Alexander, we've been speaking all season with all of our operas about this semi-quincentennial, 250 years of celebrating the signing of the Declaration of Independence, a time to celebrate our amazing accomplishments as a country, but also looking, have we as a country lived up to our core values and beliefs? Have we lived up to those founding ideals, or are we still, perfecting our union? What are you hoping will be on the minds and hearts of attendees as they go through this immersive experience?
Our premise for the show is actually a question, which is, what does 1776 mean to you? And the nature of John Cage's pieces is that the whole reason he was engaging chance operations and indeterminacy, this idea of sort of removing more choices from the artist, and rather than making this element of randomness and the unexpected as a core part of the experience, is that he didn't want to tell you what to think and how to feel. That's really what he was interested in, is getting out of the kind of tyranny of like presentational, representational theater, right? And the way that you have a protagonist who has a thing, and then here's where everybody cries, and here's the hero who wins the thing, He was interested in something that was much more of a mystical experience comparatively. So as this relates to this project, he wanted to be as open-ended as possible, So that's when I was building the piece, I started out by asking my collaborators, well, what does this mean to you? And even working with Selena, okay, 1776, and it's 2026. What does that mean to you right now? And honestly, it was the answers that I was getting from the artists that I was working with that helped me clarify the point of view of the piece, which is that, 1776 and 2026, I think we're still thinking about liberation. We're still thinking about freedom, whether that's in the individual space or in the collective space. And it means having to contend with some aspects that are, of our collective identity that are not as easy to look at, and confront some legacies that are kind of uncomfortable to deal with. But I think just like in an individual, if you can look at the parts of yourself that are where you failed and where your sort of character defects are, that's how you really can make a resolution to move on and to grow spiritually. And also in the answers, there was the expression of people wanting to heal, wanting to grow spiritually, want to liberate the minds of the young people that are around them. And a lot of those impulses are very much in consonance with the ideas that are in the fabric and the founding of the country.
Wow, fantastic. Now it makes me wonder, as I'm talking to Selena, although I don't want to lead you down one path or another, what was in your thinking then as you were thinking about 1776 in 2026, as you were thinking about this perspective, the indigenous perspective?
Well, 1776 is often framed as a beginning, but as Native people, we've been here since time immemorial. We live in a space of continuity in this land. And so I feel like that tension is something that I bring to the work. And also Declaration of Independence, it's in 1776, that was independence for some. And I also believe that Alexander is right. Like, we think about the document of the Declaration, it's a fallible document. And so it like has space for iteration, for change, for moving forward. But I also don't want to think that my presence or my personhood resolves that. So I think that I would like to exist in that tension between being present in like this moving, changing experience, but not that my presence resolves that. And I think 2026 opens that space to consider that. Coast Salish people have been on Coast Salish land for 50,000 years, at least. So Christ is walking around doing his thing, and tens of thousands of years before that, Coast Salish people have been on Coast Salish land.
I just have one final question for Alexander, for me anyway. Can you talk to us a little bit about the creative team you've assembled to take us through Apartment House 1776 and what are they contributing? How are you envisioning costumes? Who's working with you? Who's your team?
So I have a pretty small team. It's basically me and two other folks that I have worked with very closely for a long time. The scenographer and costume designer, Lena Sands, and the dramaturg, Hyun Nam, both of whom I consider to be friends, and we've worked together for years. And then I knew would be the perfect team for this because there's no script, there's no story. We're making something completely out of scratch. And there's only a few people that really have the stomach for that. And I happen to love the fear of walking into an empty space and having no idea what's going to happen. Like, I'm sort of addicted to the terror, the creative terror of that experience. So we really, and Hyun is a dramaturg. A lot of people aren't really familiar with that term. It's a lot more popular in Europe, but I guess this opera crowd's going to know what a dramaturg is. But in devised theater, a dramaturg can almost be like a writer. Like, Hyun is really very closely working with me to help me get at the meat of what is the concept and what is the methodology? How do we find the right methodology, right? And that has to be a conversation with, as we're talking to the singers, as we're understanding what the space is, to figure out, okay, well, how can we structure this process? How can we come up with a vision for the design that's true to Cage, but also being dynamically responsive to this particular space, this city, this audience, these artists that are involved. And so that's a big part of it. And the number one thing that we knew is that we wanted it to be an accessible feeling experience, right? Like Cage can be so esoteric and far out. And I wanted people who have no idea who John Cage is, who've never even been to an opera, to come out of this show and be like, wow, that was a wild ride. That was super crazy. That was super cool, you know? So that's on a basic level, I just want it to communicate and feel accessible to people as an experience, even though it's an abstract experience. And on a design level, what that means, you know, Lena and I are always interested in what is epic and ceremonial and holy about the individuals that we work with. You know, rather than characters that they're playing, what is the myth that is existing inside of each one of us? And how can we do work to find a projection or an expression of that is going to be legible in a way that an audience can understand it, you know? And that works out really perfectly with this piece because we're asking folks to engage with their ancestry and to engage with their dreams of the future. And at the intersection is you know, at the intersection of the past and present, you're holding both of those things. You're holding the DNA sleeve of your ancestors, and you are also the inception of all of the descendants that will come after you. So it's sort of, I don't know, a ceremonial practice of theater making, I think works very well with this particular piece.
And we should mention, we touched on it a little bit, but that this is not happening at the Detroit Opera House. It's happening at the beautiful Cranbrook Art Museum in Bloomfield Hills. And how did the space, like when you walked into the space, did that influence your concept of what you wanted to do? Did it feed your artistic vision?
So I'm going to be totally honest. I was a little bit wary of doing this piece in a museum, right? Because when you've already got a piece that you've got this danger where Cage has said, you know, this person does Negro spirituals, this person's singing tribal songs, like you're already really at the risk of like tokenizing or being tokenized, which I would hate to do that. And then the idea of doing the piece in a museum just ramps up those stakes even higher because like presenting things in a museum space becomes like objectification, you know, like let's do Negro spirituals next to a classical orchestra in a museum. And like so many things, the thing that I'm most afraid of, or what becomes the liability and my tension with that liability becomes the core of the idea, you know, as we're building out the concept, which is, oh, wait a minute. This is a museum, which means all of these choices are curated, which means that we can actually bring a hyper awareness to how you're looking at things and what it is to be perceived. You know, when Selena talks about this responsibility of being mindful about what she shares and recognizing what isn't shareable, using the tension of this space is a perfect complement to the tension and ambivalencies that we feel about 1776, you know? And honestly, the tension that I feel about even making something that has a political aspect to it in 2026. It's a really a fraught time. And I think the more that you embrace the tension in all of these spaces, the cooler the stuff that you start to come up with is.
That is fantastic. Is there anything that we haven't touched on, either Selena or Alexander, do you think would be important to make sure we include?
I think it would be really cool to just jump on the fact that our four singers are three resident artists of Detroit Opera: Travis Williams, Brianna Robinson, and Mia Mandanao. And Selena Kearney is not one of these folks, and her practice is actually as a visual and installation artist, of which singing is an extension and a part of her practice. So I was really excited to have Selena in this at having a different kind of practice than these other folks, and to really allow to lean into her language of how her practice already uses these songs as being something different. And I wonder, Selena, if you'd be down to maybe elaborate on that a little bit, of how it feels to be bringing your practice into this space.
I feel like I am bringing activation in relation. So like my movement through the space and my presence in the space is a different register of activation, and it is in relation to the experience that's happening. And so I carry and bring the song to the space, and I have a different framework for understanding the utility of song. And so I carry that with me. And my hope is that I activate both the space, the other performers, and then the witnesses that exist, and that those three things make up what the experience will be. And I feel like that is how I think about resonance in song. And I believe that that holds true to Cage as well, and what Cage sort of hopes in his indeterminacy and chance operations.
Yeah, I just want to say that I love, like one of the reasons I love making this kind of work is the diversity of artists that you get to, the diversity of practices that you get to be engaged with. And it's really exciting to be working with you, Selena, at the same time as working with folks where opera singing is actually the primary part of their practice. And they're coming from this with completely different kind of concerns. And I think it like, that's, Cage called these things muses circuses, the idea, like, it was not like a concert. It's like these different things are happening where you can go see, a whole spectacle happening in all of these different places. So I think that brings a big asset to this particular production.
I also believe that that is what brings it into the present moment. I think that those things that Cage couldn't quite understand, or wasn't quite determined, wasn't planned, is what allows something to be written in 76 to make sense in 2026.
Yeah, the flexibility of it. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I want to thank both Alexander Gedeon and Selena Kearney for being our guests today. You have really dropped some pearls of wisdom on us, and we can't wait to see and hear what this production is going to look like, Apartment House 1776. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Well, that was a fantastic conversation, Nathalie. I particularly loved, actually, both conversations were fantastic, but when Selena talked about this music and this Salish, folks that the Salish tribe was walking, these shores even during the time of Christ. It just kind of, puts things in perspective about 1776 and where we are today in 2026.
It's an amazing teaser for people to come and see what else is in store during this wonderful immersive experience. So I'm really excited. I'm excited we got to talk to them today.
Well, Nathalie, thank you once again for joining me. This is our last opera for the season. We'll be back next year, of course.
Of course. And Arthur, I love doing this with you. It's so much fun. And thank you to everyone listening to our glimpse into Detroit Opera's production of Apartment House 1776. We hope to see you at the Cranbrook Art Museum in Bloomfield Hills for this immersive production, which opens May 21st and runs through May 24th.
To purchase tickets to Apartment House 1776 or find more information about the production, visit our website at DetroitOpera.org. You can also connect with us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, X. Thanks to Jake Meir for his assistance and producing this podcast, and we will see you at the opera.
Turn you around, turn you around, turn you around. Don't you let nobody turn you around. Keep it straight on.